This video is going to show you how to install valves into a cylinder head. But firstly, when you take out the valves or the valve gear from an engine, you want to keep things together. You want to keep the springs with their valves, with their keepers, and particularly with the valve followers. So what I have here is a handy homemade organizer which I painstakingly carved out with a router and some plywood. It's actually pretty useful. So that helps to keep everything organized and together. And on one side we have exhaust valves, and on the other intake valves. And they're numbered to match up with the cylinder head. So to install valves onto the cylinder head, what we need is the valve keepers, which are these little keys that hold the valve retainers on top of the springs. We need a pair of white gloves. We need a non-magnetic screwdriver. This is the way I do it. Some people use a magnetic screwdriver, but for me, non-magnetic screwdriver is important. We need a valve spring compressor. There's another, this is the most common type of valve installation tool. There is another tool for installing valves. I've never used it, but it looks genius in the videos that I've seen. And essentially you can just put it on top of the valve and whack it with a hammer. It works perfectly fine for me, and I actually quite like using it. So a valve spring compressor, and for this engine, the valves are recessed quite deeply into the cylinder head. So on some heads, what you'll find is that for example, the spring and the retainer would be up here. And in that case, you can push this down relatively easily. But on this particular engine, the spring and the retainer are recessed into the engine. And so we need this kind of extension or this head on the valve spring compressor in order to reach down and push that and still allow us access in here in order to fit the valve keepers. And the secret ingredient for this job is some grease. A kind of thick grease, a lithium-based grease is perfect. Just get this all over my hands before I even put the gloves on. This is why gloves are fairly pointless for me. I'm just so keen to get on with the job in hand that I just forget entirely I'm supposed to be wearing gloves. We put that on the end of the valve, and that allows us to glue, essentially, or not glue, but affix these valve keepers, and they don't fall off. That makes the job a lot easier. Doing this without grease is an extremely difficult and frustrating task. This is it's fiddly. It's not technically difficult, it's just a fiddly job, and by the time you've done 16 valves into the head, you'll be working much faster than you were with the first one. So don't be surprised if installing the first valve is incredibly frustrating and takes 5 minutes. By the time you get to the last valve, you'll be purring along like a well-oiled valve installing machine. So having already put grease all over my hands, now I put on my white gloves. But most importantly, safety specs, because we're messing around with springs here and we're putting some pressure on these springs, and we're attempting to install these valve keepers, and sometimes they can pop off and there's pressure on the spring that will ping the valve keeper out and shoot it across the room. And that's fine if it goes across the room, but this job is a lot harder with one eye. There's a few different ways to tackle this job, but for me, I find the easiest way, and I think the way that you'll see more clearly on the video, is if we just hang this over the edge of the bench. I like this way because we're not fighting against gravity, so the springs and the retainers are kind of vertical, which helps certainly. So this is the way to go. It becomes a bit more difficult as you get towards the center, so we may want to clamp this down, but let's see how we go. The last thing you want to do is to drop a cylinder head on the floor, because that's going to cause some serious damage. We'll start with the first exhaust valve. We take that valve, we insert that here, and run that into the valve guide. Now we want to rotate this back around, drop on the spring, making sure that we've got the tight coils at the bottom, then drop on our retainer, and we're ready for the valve spring compressor. The way this works is we have a flat piece here, and this pushes against the head of the valve, and this piece here pushes down on the retainer. So we want to make sure that this is fitted over the valve. Now we can clamp this down onto the retainer. Now the important thing is to make sure that the retainer goes down centered over the valve stem. That makes life much easier as we get to the next step. The way I install these keepers is, first I coat them on the inside with a little bit of grease. Not too much, that was a bit much. And then I use some grease on the outside as a sort of temporary glue to hold them to a screwdriver, just a flat bladed screwdriver. And then I use that screwdriver to install these carefully with a finger into the cylinder head and locate them in the groove. And now you can use your finger to rotate them around and they stay in the groove held in with the grease. The reason I don't like magnetic screwdrivers is it becomes very hard to take the screwdriver out and not pull the valve keeper out. So this is a reasonable flow and you can get these in quite quickly, I think. With both of them in, we just make sure that they are located, and now we can take the pressure off this spring compressor and that should locate the retainer. Before you do this, just take a look down and make sure that as you're bringing the retainer up, it's coming up centered on the keepers, because what we don't want to happen is for the retainer to catch the underside of one of the keepers and lift it up above or push it out of the slot. So just take a look, ensure that's located in the center, and then just take the pressure off slowly. We don't want to just explode this thing. So that's one valve installed, and now we just continue our way along, do all 16 valves and become valve installation masters until the next time we do this. I'm curious to watch this video back because everybody tells me I look like a complete idiot when I'm concentrating. So I'm sure my valve installation face looks something like this. Concentrating. I think the key to this job is to make sure there's more grease on the inside of the keeper than on the outside and on the screwdriver, because then it wants to stick to the valve. Once we've put it in here, it wants to stay attached to the valve, and then we can just slide the screwdriver off and pull it out. There's loads of tricks and tips that I've seen people using for this, but the truth is, it's just persistence, and this way of doing it with a screwdriver and some grease just seems, once you've got the hang of it, I can't think that there's going to be much that's faster than this. And you don't need any special tools. As you work your way around, just be sure that these keepers are seated correctly into the valves. These two are fine, these two are fine. Just be double sure that the keepers are set right. I'm struggling with this one here, and the reason is because I didn't follow my own advice, and the retainer is not centered on the valve stem, so there's actually no space to fit this keeper in there. So that's why, if you're struggling with one, just be sure that you've got the retainer centered onto the valve stem, because when it's not, life is much, much harder. Now that that's centered, as I come in with this, it's going to find its groove with no trouble at all. Now we should be able to release this spring, and there we go. Now that I've reached roughly halfway, we're at the risky point of the head tipping off the bench, so I'm going to take a clamp and just lightly clamp this down. Not too much, but just to give it a bit of stability there. Lovely. Now we've got no danger of this falling off. These valve spring compressors come with different size heads, so what you need to know is the diameter of your valve opening or the diameter of your valve head, which may be different from the opening. So maybe hit the forums and see what people recommend for the particular engine that you're dealing with. Because if you have recessed valves like this, then you need the fitting that goes on here. And you can't simply use a socket or something, because you need to be able to get a finger inside. You can actually make these from PVC pipe of the right diameter, but if you buy a good quality spring compressor, hopefully it comes with all the heads that you could need. We're going for the last one now, finally. Satisfying job this. I feel like we've made progress today. That's all the valves installed, but let's just quickly show you how to remove valves because it's actually a slightly different process. So you take your valve spring compressor, install that over the valve, compress it down, and then instead of using a screwdriver, I use one of these magnetic pickup tools, and this is the perfect tool for this job. Very rarely use these, but for this, it's perfect. You simply feed it around the valve stem and it magnetically sucks out these valve keepers. And now we can take the pressure off the spring nice and slowly. And there we have it. One valve retainer, one valve spring, and we can pull out the valve from underneath. That's all the valves installed. Before you finish up, just run your eye along and just check that these are all seated correctly. The keepers are kind of flush with the retainer, and look at the springs and just double check that you've installed all the springs the correct way up. What you can do, if you like hitting things with a hammer, you can take a socket and you can just put the socket over the top of the retainer, just give it a whack with a hammer, and that's going to make sure that these are all set right. But there's really no need because here we can see that these are all flush, they're all set correctly. So that's good. Next job, we'll bolt down the cylinder head onto the block and install the camshafts.